Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak daily Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. Does US President Donald Trump have an endgame in Venezuela? Which Latin American leader should be most concerned about the Donroe Doctrine, and what could it mean in concrete terms for US foreign and security policy? And should Greenland and Canada really be worried as well? I think Trump is trying to establish a sphere of influence in which the United States can do what it wants in the Western Hemisphere, says Renata Keller, a history professor at the University of Nevada. She is an expert on modern Latin America, the Cold War, and the war on drugs, and she recently published a book, The Fate of the Americas, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Hemispheric Cold War. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. Renata, let me quote from the new American National Security Strategy first. After years of neglect, the United States will reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. We will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities, or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. This Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is a common sense and potent restoration of American power and priorities consistent with American security interests. How do you assess this approach? What some have called the Donroe Doctrine, because of Donald Trump. What could it mean in concrete terms for U.S. foreign and security policy?
I think this new Trump corollary or Donroe Doctrine is offensive and dangerous. It harkens back not so much to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was actually an anti-imperialist statement declaring that European powers had no right to recolonize any part of the Americas, especially Latin America. And it also promised that the United States would not try to colonize any parts of Europe. What Trump is playing off of is actually the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, in which President Theodore Roosevelt in the early 20th century declared that the United States had policing powers in the hemisphere and that the United States had the right to make sure that its Latin American neighbors were behaving properly and could enforce this through what came to be known as gunboat diplomacy, where the United States used its naval power to invade Latin American countries, take over their treasuries, force them to pay back debts, things like that. And so what Trump is doing is trying to reenact the Roosevelt corollary that fell out of favor when people realized that it was really counterproductive and created a lot of instability in the hemisphere and contributed to a lot of human rights violations and dictatorships. And then we implemented the good neighbor policy under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a different Roosevelt president, which was much more a stance of mutual respect in the Americas. And Trump is departing from that stance of mutual respect. This new Trump corollary is essentially declaring that the United States once again, has the right to intervene in other countries' domestic affairs and dictate their foreign policies, their relationships with other powers like Russia and China. And so it is returning to this stance that we know, those of us who study history know fosters instability, and it is especially detrimental to the people living in Latin America whose countries are invaded.
You mentioned the Roosevelt corollary. Then you also mentioned Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that he changed the policies. Mm-hmm. But then we had a Cold War. And of course, we have seen a lot of meddling of the U.S. into Latin American affairs. Was the Roosevelt corollary and what happened in the Cold War somehow connected, or it was just historically not that connected?
So the Roosevelt corollary era, we saw much more overt intervention, like the gunboat diplomacy that I mentioned, where we directly went into other countries, invaded them, took over parts of their government, like the police forces, things like that. During the Cold War, it was an era where we saw more covert intervention on the part of the United States. So the United States used its new Central Intelligence Agency to interfere secretly in other Latin American governments' business. An example would be in 1954 when the CIA and the U.S. Army and the U.S. State Department helped organize a coup in Guatemala, overthrowing a democratically elected government. Another example is in 1973 when the CIA and the U.S. Army and the U.S. government, the State Department, encouraged a coup in Chile to overthrow another democratically elected government. And so in both these cases, it wasn't so much like sending in the Marines. It was more the CIA secretly cooperating with right-wing forces throughout Latin America to seize power, to persecute leftist movements, things like that.
So the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela and his wife is maybe something in between, because there was a direct military action, but the US didn't took over the Venezuelan territory. So this is something in between?
Yeah, it's a little bit in between. That's a good way to describe it. The closest comparison would be Panama in 1989, early 1990, when the United States invaded and seized Manuel Noriega, the self-declared president of Panama. That would be the closest comparison. But Venezuela's different because there was a clear goal of regime change in the Noriega operation, and we don't see that with Maduro. The United States captured Maduro, but it's still a Chavista government. It's still his surrounding circle of advisors who are still in power. And so the motivation of regime change, of supposedly implementing a democratic government, seems to be completely absent in the case in Venezuela today.
What do you think is Trump's endgame in Venezuela? Also taking into the account that, as you mentioned, there is a still Chavista government there, but we also saw the Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Machado giving the prize or the medal to Trump. So there are somehow conflicting interests, seems so. So from your perspective, what might be Trump's endgame in Venezuela?
I don't think he has a clear end game. I think he has various goals. I think Trump and his advisors have various goals that kind of came together in capturing Maduro. I think part of it was oil. I think Trump's made it very clear that he wants to control Venezuela's oil wealth directly to his own personal benefit. We don't know where those oil dollars are going currently, but it appears they're going to Trump. I think another motivation was on the part of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, hoping to undermine the Cuban government and cut off Venezuelan oil to Cuba and all Venezuelan support to Cuba, because Rubio is of Cuban descent and has for a long time made it his goal to overthrow Cuba's Fidelista government. And I think part of it is just trying to show that the United States was strong and that the United States can do what it wants in the hemisphere, a show of power, like a kinetic action, as they call it in the army, to show this kind of very masculine bravado that, we're the strongest in the world, or at least in the region, and we can do what we want. And if Maduro is resisting us, we don't have to listen to him. It's a very interventionist aesthetic and motivation. So I think it's a combination of various motivations.
But do you think that we might see a repeated kinetic action against Venezuela?
I don't think Trump wants to get embroiled in a full-scale invasion of Venezuela. I think memories of Iraq and Afghanistan are still fresh enough to make people hesitant, including Trump, to take over the entire country or to try to do so. I think some part of him knows, that would be a really difficult, well-on impossible thing to do. And I think he doesn't need to do so. If he can get the Venezuelan government to cooperate and do whatever he wants, I think that would be his preferred option.
If you could summarize a bit the reactions that are coming from Latin America after the Venezuela operation. Of course, we have seen some countries being openly supportive of Trump, like Argentinian President Javier Milei. But of course, there's a lot of criticism and also a lot of pointing out to the history. So could you maybe briefly summarize what we see from Latin America?
The reactions across Latin America have been pretty divided. I think everyone can agree, almost everyone can agree, that Maduro was not a good leader for Venezuela. And I think a lot of people are relieved to see him gone. I think a lot of people across Latin America don't like the way that he was removed. They don't like the United States' role and the message that this sends about the lack of sovereignty that the United States is willing to respect among its Latin American neighbors. So the leaders of Mexico and Brazil and Colombia have spoken out very strongly against the action against Maduro and pointed out that it shows a complete lack of respect for other countries and could set a really dangerous precedent anytime that Trump disagrees with something that some other country's leader does, that he just goes in and invades and takes takes the leader hostage, shows a complete lack of respect for the rule of law. But like you pointed out, some national leaders like those Argentina have praised Trump for taking action. And so it's been a really divided response, more so than what we saw when the United States took Noriega captive in 1989, 1990.
Because of the Donroe Doctrine, as we have been talking about, do you think that Trump might really think about, okay, I don't like the president of this or that country, or I don't like the leader of this or that country, let's do something about it? Do you think we might really see actions like this?
Yeah, because I think he has seen the Venezuela operation as a complete success. And so his lesson is, hey, this works. And so I think this is really dangerous for other Latin American leaders. And if I were in their position, I'd be really worried that the United States would repeat this. We're trying to do it again right now with Greenland. And so clearly the lesson for Trump's administration was that this kind of behavior works and helps meet their objectives and it helps get them what they want. And so I think it hasn't sent the right message to them at all.
So who should be the most worried in Latin America right now?
Probably Cuba. Cuba would be at the top of my list. They don't have oil like Venezuela does, but they also don't have a lot of way to defend themselves if the United States does decide to intervene. It's a much smaller country than Venezuela or the United States. And a lot of the Cuban population would also be pretty relieved to see some change there. Although, like the Venezuelans, I don't think they would want change through these means. There's also a very strong sense of nationalism in Cuba, just like Venezuela. So Cuba would be the top of my list. Brazil, because there's been this history of Trump supporting Bolsonaro and trying to meddle in Brazilian democracy. So I'd be concerned if I were in Brazil. Mexico, because there's been such an issue with drugs and drug trafficking. Trump has actually gotten a lot of cooperation from Mexico when it comes to drug trafficking. And yet, it's still a very easy way to justify to the public that they're sending drugs into our country and we're going to put a stop to it. And they've been making a lot of statements to that effect. So those are probably the top 3 countries that I would say should be concerned.
But what can Trump do? I can imagine a lot of things these days, to be honest, but I don't know. Can he kidnap President Lula or something like that?
I mean, maybe. I think if they tried to repeat what they did in Venezuela and work with the internal opposition, Bolsonaro does still have his supporters in Brazil. And they're out of power right now, but they're still there and they're still in the military. And so I think there could be ways. I think it would be harder in a place like Brazil, certainly. But I think that doesn't mean that Trump wouldn't try.
How popular, if we can say, are such policies among Americans? I mean, U.S. meddling in Latin American affairs.
I like to think that they aren't very popular. I would hope the better angels among my fellow U.S. citizens would prevail. I think most people here in the United States don't want to get involved in another war like Iraq and Afghanistan. Like I said, that memory is still very fresh. And so I think anywhere in the world, we don't want that again. But I think a lot of the people here in the United States also don't really care that much about Venezuela and wonder why. Like, why bother? Why risk another war? And those Americans who don't pay attention to Venezuela, it doesn't really make sense. For those of us who do study Latin America, it's really appalling.
In my region, you can still, Central and Eastern Europe, you can still hear the argument that what the United States did in Latin America during the Cold War was not perfect, but since it was fighting communism, it was not such a big deal. What is your reaction to this line of thinking?
I'm a big proponent of self-determination. I think especially when the United States was overthrowing democratically elected governments, that's unacceptable. Whether they are socialist, communist, capitalist, what have you. I think people should be allowed to elect their own leaders, and it shouldn't be the responsibility of any foreign power to intervene covertly or overtly to remove a democratically elected government.
You already mentioned Greenland. So, do you think that what Trump is doing, or how is Trump perceiving Latin America, can be applied also what he's doing or how he's perceiving Greenland and Canada? At the end, they're also the part of the Western Hemisphere.
Yes, I think he's trying to establish a sphere of influence and to establish that the Western Hemisphere, between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans are the U.S. territory, essentially, and the United States can do it at once in that region. And so I think he's just a very simple-minded person and looking at maps and saying that, well, because it's here, it should be ours. And so I think he has very little respect for history or, like I said, self-determination, and just wants to expand U.S. influence in this region.
Some EU leaders have warned that the U.S. move on Greenland could mean the end of NATO. I know that every historical comparison is imperfect, but could NATO or the transatlantic alliance, let's put it that way, evolve into something resembling the Organization of American States during the Cold War, when the organization tried to balance its own agency against overwhelming U.S. influence? Is there any way how to compare those two things, or you think this is very different?
Yeah, I think you could make that comparison. There were moments when the Organization of American States stood up to the United States, but they were few and far between. The United States was the dominant power in the Organization of American States throughout the Cold War. They couldn't always determine what individual countries did, but they could usually determine the overall outcome. I think that is less likely to happen with NATO. I think that is what U.S. leaders currently would like to see NATO do, is just fall in line with the United States and just unquestioningly go along with what the United States wants to do. But I suspect that European leaders will resist more strongly, especially when it's territory that's at question. We've seen European leaders be open to negotiate things like economic trade treaties and things like that, providing more support to Ukraine when the United States stepped back recently. But I think the question of control of territory is extremely sensitive and the kind of thing that NATO leaders would draw a very clear line on. And I think the Organization of American States would too, right? Like, it wasn't like the United States was going around taking over and absorbing other member countries of the Organization of American States during the Cold War. So I think there could be some similarities, but significant differences as well.
Bernard, I don't expect a nuclear standoff between the US and Europe or Greenland anytime soon. But you have written that a key lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that the United States needs allies. Again, I don't expect Trump to be particularly interested in historical lessons, but the fact is that the system of alliances, maybe imperfect system, but still a system of alliances, have served America very well, I would argue. Do you think the US president is really willing to ruin it, to destroy it?
I think he is. I think, like I said, is no student of history, doesn't care about what worked in the past or what brought us to the brink of nuclear war, and doesn't care one bit about alliances. I think he perceives the United States as powerful enough to do what it wants, at least in the Western Hemisphere, and is willing to divide up the world between the United States, Russia, and China, and force other countries to go along with that. I don't think he's shown any interest at all in building or maintaining alliances.
So finally, and you just mentioned it, some people argue that clearly defined spheres of influence among great powers can bring stability to the world. I find this deeply unrealistic, to be honest. Even if Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping were to carve up the world, I don't believe such an arrangement could ever be stable. It would be inevitably lead to permanent confrontation, in my view, either because great powers would seek to expand further or because even the smallest countries have agency. What do you think?
I agree completely. I think we could look at the history of the Cold War when there were spheres of influences, that the United States and the Soviet Union tried to divide the world into spheres of influences. And there was an incredible amount of violence. Hundreds of millions of people died. Like you said, especially in these other countries that do have agency. You might think you have spheres of influences, but people have their own agendas and countries have their own decisions to make. And so you see places like Vietnam where, that dragged the so-called great powers into their struggle, or across Latin America. We could look at places where there were, hundreds of thousands of people died in Guatemala that was supposedly within the U.S. sphere of influence, but people still cared very deeply about issues of capitalism and communism and land right and self-determination and all of these other issues. And so I think the idea that spheres of influence would bring peace is really, really deeply flawed.
So why do you think people still somehow trying to stick to this?
Because it serves their own purposes, because it justifies things like territorial acquisition in Greenland or, taking over Venezuela's oil industry. I think the people who are promoting this idea are the people who want to expand their own power and see it as like a trade-off. Like, you can have Europe, we can have the Americas, and they don't care one little bit about people in the other parts of the world. They only care about their national power or even their personal power.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.